This presentation will address stratification of knowledge, the English language learner, deficit, or resource. In 1842, Howard Mann said, "Education, then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery." And though it may have been true at the time that he spoke it, I'm not so sure that it is true of education today. So what is the issue that will be covered in this presentation? English language learners may not be receiving an equitable educational experience in comparison to their native English-speaking peers due to the approach or approaches that their teachers are using in their delivery of instruction and activities in the classroom. Some of the questions that will be considered during this presentation are as follows. What approaches are being used by teachers for the instruction of ELLs? Is the educational experience for ELLs equitable? And why is an asset-based approach more suitable, appropriate, and effective for ELL instruction? In order to more fully understand the issue regarding ELLs, it's important to understand the context in which that is seated. So what will be briefly considered during the course of the presentation is the following: stratification in society and education, knowledge, whose and which, marginalized populations, English language learners, and deficit-based or asset-based pedagogy. In our readings thus far for class, we've talked a little bit about stratification, and two types in particular. One is societal and the other is educational. Nicole Sweeney, in one of the crash course videos, noted that stratification is a characteristic of society. It's not a matter of individual differences. It's a ranking or a hierarchy. She noted that it's universal and variable, and it persists across generations. But it's also about beliefs. She noted that if people didn't believe the system was right, it wouldn't last. Sociologist Daniel Rosides defines social stratification as follows: a hierarchical configuration of families who have differential access to whatever is of value in the society at a given point and over time, primarily because of social, not biopsychological variables. When thinking about educational stratification, there are four key areas. The first is there's a stratification of people. They're arranged according to how much they have of the goods that are valued in society. So schools are organized for children, and the school has expectations and almost determinations of how well those children will perform, both in school and in future occupations. Additionally, there's a stratification of educational experience that's based on class. Sadovnik said that he spoke in terms actually of status attainment, and that attainment was seen within the scope of class, race, and gender. Basically, what he suggests is that U.S. society is still highly stratified by race, and an individual's race has a direct impact on how much education the individual, he or she, is likely to achieve. In a society that's as segregated as the U.S., he indicates that minority students receive fewer and inferior educational opportunities than white students. The third type of educational stratification has to do with educational credentials. Ivar Berg talked about educational credentials having become the new property in America. McNamee and Miller also talked about this in terms of it ratcheting up credential requirements and almost like there's a credentials inflation. But they said that it's only an indirect means of assessing a person's capacity to perform on-the-job tasks. In other words, if you have the credentials, they don't actually test you, they take the word of the credential. The fourth area of educational stratification has to do with curriculum. And in this idea or this notion, it's that some types of knowledge and some types of instructional practices are considered superior to others. And so if you don't have those, that type of knowledge, you're not up to par, or you're not considered in the upper echelon with regard to the stratification. This stratification, whether it's societal or educational, centers around the idea of knowledge. Scholars such as Gloria Ladson-Billings and Dolores Delgado Bernal have asked the questions, whose knowledge counts and whose knowledge is discounted? And when we think about knowledge, we often think about it in terms of capital. And there are two main kinds that are focused in on, cultural and social. Bordeaux said that cultural capital refers to an accumulation of cultural knowledge, skills, and abilities possessed and inherited by privileged groups in society. The dominant groups within the society are able to maintain power because access is limited to acquiring and learning strategies to use these forms of capital for social mobility. So the dominant group decides which knowledge is considered valuable, and then they sort of hoard it, in the sense that it's not accessible to everyone. It refers to an accumulation of specific forms of knowledge and skills, abilities that are valued by privileged groups in society. McNamee and Miller basically say the same thing when they say that cultural capital refers to knowledge of the norms, values, beliefs, and the way of life of the group to which people belong. It's interesting that cultural capital that sort of defines and sets out an inequality within social circles isn't just about wealth and power, but it's also about culture. It's the claims that one group's culture ranks higher in social standing than another's, and that can be based on almost anything. But it is, in order for it to function, it's required on a claim of superiority and getting others to sort of go along with it. Cultural capital, therefore, receives proportionately greater weight in the justification of privilege. It intensifies or perpetuates this idea of privilege. Student cultural capital is a significant net predictor of school success, including all things like grades, college and postgraduate attendance, completion, and educational attainment of a spouse. When thinking about knowledge and whose knowledge or which knowledge is most important or most valuable, it isn't only about cultural capital, but also social capital, which refers to who you know. Or it's a non-merit resource, but it's a resource that individuals can exploit to advance their positions in society. It's that idea that connections matter. When we're thinking about education and social capital, it's that form of parental or familial level of support. But it also goes beyond that to the friend of the friend. So it's that networking that will provide us that support. Not all individuals or social groups uniformly acquire social capital or acquire it in the same manner, or receive equivalent returns from its use. So you might belong to a group in which you have a network that can support you, but it might not be the exact network that's going to advance you the way a network of someone who is more privileged might do so. As we think more specifically about knowledge and whose knowledge or which knowledge is considered most valuable, we need to think in terms of the sociology of knowledge that's concerned about the definition of knowledge or how it's constructed. Humans are the ones who construct and modify knowledge within their social interactions. It's not this objective body of facts like we might think about it, but it is constructed by humans and therefore is value-laden. That's why, as we have groups that are privileged or hold more power, when they determine that this is knowledge and individuals don't have access to it or are not privileged to have that knowledge, then they are considered less than and are more easily marginalized. The transmission of a particular curriculum occurs as the result of a complicated system of historical and cultural beliefs, those hegemonic ideologies, the pressure groups, the textbook markets. And so we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about knowledge in terms of those students like English language learners who don't have access to the knowledge that's considered the valuable knowledge. There are two central concerns with regard to this sociology of knowledge. As I've mentioned sort of previously, what is valued and how do certain types of knowledge become reality in our everyday lives through that social interaction in schools? The organization of school implies that both the structure of knowledge and the social relationships are hierarchical as a reflection of the larger society. So knowledge is organized according to its perceived difficulty and its social value. So far as we've been gearing up to the examination of the issue of ELLs and the types of approaches that are provided in the classroom, we've looked at societal and educational stratification. We've also looked at the construction of knowledge within the framework of our social interactions. And as a result of both of those things, there are certain populations that are marginalized. And this happens due to or within the framework of several different things. As we think about educational meritocracy, if you remember at the very beginning, I shared the quote from Howard Mann that education is intended to be the great equalizer. And as we've read with some of the articles that we've looked at this semester already, we talked about or saw this idea of meritocracy. And if you work really hard, then you can attain within the educational world and within society. However, Jerome Carabel expressed that there's a history of struggle over this idea of merit, of the meaning of merit. He defines merit, or he says that the definition of merit is fluid, and it tends to reflect the values and interests of those, again, who have the power to impose their particular ideals. Meritocracy, according to McNamee and Miller, requires equality of educational opportunity. The schooling system, however, provides the most privileged in society with the greater opportunities to succeed and fewer chances to fail than it does for those who are from less privileged backgrounds. So the intention is that even though it's intended to help, it doesn't actually always do that. Another idea connected to educational meritocracy is that privileged children are already ahead of the game, so to speak, than less privileged children with regard to cognitive ability, social skills, and cultural capital when they enter school. And teachers' expectations build on these initial advantages, further marginalizing certain populations. An additional aspect of marginalization has to do with educational inequality. Because schools are where routes of access to success, mobility, etc. are supposed to be equalized and actualized for all children. But instead what happens is there are sets of opportunities for children with regard to different race and class backgrounds that are structurally unequal from the very beginning, and they're further perpetuated by the inequality embedded in the system. The measurement of educational competencies can further marginalize certain groups. Education certifies individual skills, knowledge, and other competencies in the form of diplomas, certificates, and degrees. The opportunity to acquire such competencies, however, is again socially constructed. And as a result, education performs a dual role in both certifying individual achievement and also reproducing existing inequalities. Educational deficits in cultural capital can marginalize certain populations as well. Children from lower classes with less cultural capital or less perceived cultural capital are eliminated from the system because of their cultural capital deficits, or they sort of self-eliminate. as they look at themselves with low objective chances of achieving success within a particular system. Educational experiences themselves can be a cause for marginalization. Scholars have argued that the public schools in complex industrial societies like our own make available different types of educational experience and curriculum knowledge to students in different social classes. Those in a lower social class receive a different type of experience with regard to instruction and resources than those that come from a higher social class. Bearstein, Bordeaux, and Apple have argued that knowledge and skills leading to social power and reward are made available to the advantaged social groups, but are withheld from the working classes to whom a more practical curriculum is offered. Additionally, with regard to educational experiences, you'll remember the research study by Aynan in 1977 of the 5 schools, the 2 working class, the middle class, the upper class, and the executive elite school, that showed very clearly that the type and the focus of instruction and the resources made available to the students were very different according to the social class. McNamee and Miller note that discrimination on the basis of any number of ascribed characteristics, including race and ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality, disability status, and even looks, can affect educational, occupational, and income attainment. Now that we have set the stage for the context in which English language learners find themselves, in a societal and educational system that is stratified and often puts them at a disadvantage, and a construction of knowledge within a group of individuals in power that may not value the knowledge that they bring as an immigrant population or a non-native speaker of English population. I think it's important for us to understand a few basic things about this group of students. When they've been identified as English language learners, there is an accommodation made for them where they can participate in language assistance programs to help ensure that they attain English proficiency and meet the academic content and achievement standards that all students are expected to meet. The No Child Left Behind legislation under President Bush really sort of shone a light on this. The issue is, however, that there was no standardization of how this was to be accomplished in schools across the country. There is also a differentiation with regard to how many English language learners are within a school district. When you are dealing with border states like, say, California or Arizona or Texas, where the ELL population is quite large, there are a large number of students perhaps in particular classes. There may be even programs that are specific just for ELLs within the school. But many school districts across the nation find themselves dealing with what are called isolated ELLs, where there may be just 2 or 3 in a particular classroom. Or in the case of a high school that I was in Canton, Ohio, where the population of the school itself was around 1,500 students, and there were 75 English language learners in the school, but 8 different languages represented. There was an ESL director in the school to work with them, but the students were mainstreamed and the teachers were ill-equipped to deal with their needs. So exacerbating the issues of an inequitable access, perhaps, to education for ELLs is the fact that this population is growing dramatically faster in recent history, and teacher training has not been able to keep up with it in order to provide an equitable educational experience for these students. This map sort of gives you an idea of where the most of the ELL population is here in Ohio. About 3.2% of our full student body is English language learners. But if you look at the states, as I mentioned, that are a little bit more border states, Florida, Texas, New Mexico, California, the populations are considerably higher. If you remember at the beginning of the presentation, the issue I shared with you was the provision of equitable educational experience and opportunities to be provided for English language learners, and that the approach be one that is going to be effective for their learning. So you may wonder, why does approach even matter? If you look at the listing here, the most recent demographics of the 50.7 million public school students from the National Center of Educational Statistics, if you'll notice here, the diversity within the school body, school student body, in comparison to the fact that 80% of public and private elementary and high school teaching force is still white. So even though the student body is very diverse, the teaching force is not. And so that presents some different perspectives, different understanding with regard to the teaching staff. When we think about children entering classrooms each day, what thoughts about them go through an educator's mind? Are children viewed walking into the classroom fully equipped with the ability to learn, or are they viewed as lacking the ability to learn? The thoughts educators have about their students in their classroom can be highly beneficial, or they can be extremely damaging to a child. When educators begin to see the glass as half empty, they are demonstrating deficit thinking. Deficit thinking is the belief that some students have internal deficiencies, such as cognitive or motivational limitations that lead to school failure. Deficit thinking has led to the belief that children in poverty are uneducatable. This leads to tracking students in remedial courses, special education, or negative school environments. And once students are tracked into these systems, it's almost impossible to climb out. They become defined by a label that represents how others see them and how they begin to see themselves. There are two basic approaches that can be utilized by instructors in the classroom. Asset-based teaching seeks to unlock students' potential by focusing on their talents. It's also known as strengths-based teaching, and this approach is in contrast with a more common and more historic perspective of deficit-based style of teaching, which highlights students' inadequacies instead. You can see from the chart here the comparison between the two approaches. National assessments, grades, and other assessment tools have supported deficient thinking by showing that children of poverty and children of color often score the lowest on assessments. The focus is always on the deficiencies of these children, which unfortunately cycles to destroy motivation, beliefs about ability, and desire to advance. One of the most unfortunate things about a deficit-based educational approach is that it takes the responsibility away from the schools and places the blame on their students, the parents, and their environment. The theory around deficit thinking posits that poverty causes students to be cognitively deprived and ignorant with low aspirations, which we know by other research not to be true. The sad thing is that the research also shows that teachers tend to set lower expectations for students with low-income homes, and there's this accepted belief that students from lower socioeconomic communities are deprived or lacking socially, culturally, and economically. Yoso noted that one of the most prevalent forms of contemporary racism in the U.S. is this idea of deficit thinking. It takes the position that minority students and families are at fault for poor academic performance because students enter school without the normative cultural knowledge and skills, and that parents neither value nor support their child's education. Garcia and Guerra's research acknowledges that deficit thinking permeates U.S. society, at least as of 2005 when this was noted, and both schools and those who work in schools mirror these beliefs. Consider, if you will, before we move on to a transition and then to asset-based educational approaches, what kind of learning environment would be provided when the view of the teacher or the school itself for any group of children, whether lower socioeconomic, whether students from a different cultural background, whether students with a lack of language proficiency, if they are perceived as deficient and inappropriately prepared for the educational opportunities that could be afforded them, what kind of learning experience might they have? Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty at the end of the 1960s led to research to understand cultural deprivation. The intent was to improve the inequitable schooling experiences of poor and working class students in U.S. public schools, mostly students of color. The cultural styles approach resulted from those efforts with the intent of discarding this deficit model thinking. Although deficit model thinking is still with us, the cultural style approach characterizes cultural ways of different groups in terms that are respectful, attempting to describe them without making value judgments that suggest value hierarchies in cultural practices. Scholars have argued that there are unique competencies that are essential to the effective teaching of historically marginalized students. One of these approaches is the asset-based pedagogy that views students' culture as a strength rather than a deficiency. In a cultural historical approach, it is assumed that individual development and disposition must be understood, not separated, not ignored, instead accepted and understood. Campano presented the idea that students learn best when their own experiences and background knowledge interact with classroom literacy. Dworin was also a proponent of asset-based educational approach, and he saw a connection between language learning and funds of knowledge, and recognized that both home language and English can be used for thinking, writing, and communication in school. Teachers can easily create an environment that fits the school curriculum while also capitalizing on the students and their community's resources. Luke suggested that teachers must learn to see students' activities as valuable areas of expertise. Mauger noted that students automatically draw upon different funds of knowledge, but school curriculums need to bridge the gap between their everyday activities and academic education. Moll et al. Explained that funds of knowledge refer not only to the categories and content of knowledge found in households, but how this knowledge is grounded, embedded in the social and cultural relationships that make up family life. Lopez and Iribarren note that there's overwhelming evidence in favor of practices that view students' native language as an asset rather than a deficiency. They also note that other researchers have found that a student's sense of belonging is a critical factor contributing to educational success. They note that one way to create an inclusive school environment is to promote culturally responsive teaching in the classroom because it addresses the needs of all students, affirms each student's cultural identity, and draws upon students' background as an asset. We have revisited the idea of social or societal stratification and educational stratification. We've considered again the construction of knowledge having to do with social interaction and determined in large part by whomever is in power. We've considered the idea that education is intended to be a great equalizer, but it doesn't always shake out that way for groups that could be marginalized or disenfranchised due to the stratification or the construction of knowledge. English language learners are one such student group. We talked a little bit about how they could be perceived as deficient due to their cultural differences or language lack of proficiency. We talked also about how they could be perceived as coming to school with funds of knowledge, and that their knowledge and their culture are actually assets that can be integrated into and utilized in the learning process. The ongoing battle for many schools is to ensure that ELLs have access to a high-quality curriculum at the classroom level. I mentioned previously that in some districts where there is a large number of ELLs, that there are specific accommodations that are made for these students. Many, however, live in districts where the population numbers are not high with regard to the number of ELLs in the school district. And so the students are integrated into or mainstreamed into regular courses, but the teachers have not kept up with the necessity for training to work with these students. And this is where, first of all and foremost, an asset-based pedagogy needs to be implemented. It has as its foundational belief that teachers who possess an understanding of socio-historical influences on traditional marginalized students' trajectories, that idea of cultural awareness, are better able to cultivate students' knowledge by building on their prior knowledge, that cultural capital that they bring, and incorporating knowledge that validates students' experiences, that cultural content integration into their instruction. Accordingly, asset-based pedagogy is believed to help students develop identities that promote academic achievement outcomes. Federal law indicates that school districts must provide research-based professional development to any teachers, administrators, and staff who work with ELLs. The training must focus on methods for working with ELLs and be offered frequently enough to have a positive and lasting impact. Research indicates that it's beneficial for ELLs if states require all general classroom teachers to have some form of ELL training, regardless of whether they work with ELLs or not. General classroom teachers help students gain proficiency in the essential areas of language proficiency, those areas of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Over 30 states do not require ELL training. Ohio is included in this group. For general classroom teachers beyond the federal requirements, although some states appear to require teacher preparation programs to provide training in working with ELLs. Only 25 of the 137 colleges and universities in Ohio offer ESL training, and none of them require it. The issue that has been focused on during the course of this presentation is that English language learners may not be receiving an equitable educational experience in comparison to their native English-speaking peers due to the approach that their teachers are using in their delivery of instruction and activity in the classroom. Throughout, we looked at or addressed aspects of these questions. What approaches are being used by teachers for the instruction of ELLs? Is the educational experience for ELLs equitable? And why is an asset-based approach more suitable, appropriate, and effective for ELL instruction? As a final notation, I think it's worthwhile to revisit a quote that was shared earlier in the presentation. Exacerbating the issues of inequitable access to education for ELLs is the fact that this population is growing at dramatically faster rates than in recent history, whereas teacher training to ensure that ELLs have access to an equitable education is pervasively lacking and outdated. Far too many teachers still hold to the concept or the idea that ELLs are deficient in either their culture or their language. And as a result, what is being provided in the classroom is not something that values and sees their culture and their language full with regard to funds of knowledge that can be integrated into the instruction and activity to provide an equitable and acceptable and accessible learning experience for these students. I am a huge advocate for pre-service teacher training with regard to English language learners in all of the content areas, since most of these students, at least at the adolescent level, middle school and high school, are integrated into the mainstream and sitting in classrooms where they need someone to see value in what they bring to the classroom.